Wait, really? We're gonna do Freeze Shaman? Okay, so today we're gonna fix the Freeze Shaman archetype to make it playable, but first we need to look at what makes the archetype special and why, if at all, is worth playing. My first thought when they started revealing the Knights of the Frozen Throne freezing cards for Shaman was, wait, isn't Freeze for Mage? Printing freeze cards for Shaman seemed out of nowhere, and maybe it was just a way to print bad cards for Shaman to balance out the classes, but if you look at Shaman, they're all about using the elements: earth, wind, fire, lava, water, lightning, and a tiny bit of freeze. So I think there's actually a legitimate spot for freeze cards in Shaman, but making the freeze mechanic the central gameplay for a Shaman deck, it's gonna be hard. Going back to Freeze Mage, the strategy was to draw all the cards needed to deal a bunch of damage with spells, but the gameplay was mostly cycling through your deck and using a bunch of freeze cards to buy yourself life and time. Shaman doesn't really use freeze like this. I mean, freeze is always good to buy you some time, but if you look at the cards, the deck's really focused on single target board control, more so than mass board freezes to conserve health. Icebreaker is kind of like a 3-charge execute, and you could potentially clear a lot of enemy value off of the board. There's definitely advantages and disadvantages to this freeze style, but I'd say that a controlling freeze shaman works more like a control warrior than a freeze mage. So with the freeze shaman cards we have today, and taking this idea of using freeze to maintain board control, the best freeze shaman deck I could make was a Murloc-Freeze hybrid. Besides the bridge Burlock mix between freeze and Murlocs, I wanted to take advantage of all of the board clears shaman has. If I can keep my enemy board clear, there's a much better chance a lot of my minions will stick on the board. Murlocs are great for filling the board and reloading quickly, so constant Murloc damage and maybe a 7 minion Bloodlust means I could try to win pretty quickly. So if you want to go and try out this deck, it could be some fun, but it's definitely not a good deck and not what I think Freeze Shaman should be. The biggest issue with Freeze Shaman is either Marabi or all the other freeze cards around Marabi. So I'll give my case for both. 6 mana 4/4. Of the 15 or so games I was able to get Murabi in play, it never once survived a turn after I played it. As soon as you play Murabi, and you'll probably freeze it with at least one freeze card, your opponent will immediately be able to clear. I don't care if they top deck a deadly shot and get a 1 out of 7 chance, there's no way your Murabi lasts more than the turn you played it on. In all seriousness, a 6 mana 4/4 is a terrible minion to be the main attraction of Freeze Shaman. I mean, it's really cool when your opponent plays a minion and you think, I want one of those, so you play Murabi and freeze that minion, and maybe as icing on the cake, you can kill that now frozen minion with Icebreaker. That's a little combo you won't be able to pull off often, but the gameplay where you're able to use Moorabi and freeze is a unique way to add value to your hand, and it's kind of what gives me hope that this could be a fun deck. But if you can only play Moorabi some games, and when you play it, it only lasts 1 turn, then that's a low percentage of gameplay where you're experiencing the best part of the deck. So what about the freeze then, huh? Well, it's a wishy-washy set of cards that doesn't really work too well with Murabi. There are the cheap spells and minions that are only really good when you have Murabi or the Icebreaker, and even then they're pretty situational. Then there are the other class cards. Cryostasis kinda works well with friendly top minions, Voodoo Hexer is really only okay against aggro, and Avalanche is just a worse meteor. And the last group is the neutral minions, which some work well in the deck, but on average your class cards are supposed to be better than the neutral cards, and the thing about Freeze Shaman is you end up running about 50% class and 50% freeze cards. That's a pretty good sign that this whole archetype's pretty weak. It's hard to tell whether it's Murabi's fault or the freeze card's fault, because it looks like these cards aren't designed with each other in mind. Why have a legendary that's value oriented but poorly statted and can only be comboed with cards that are too low value to include in a control deck? I have to include some weak cards just to hope that I draw them and a legendary at the same time. It creates a vicious cycle where you end up just shaving more and more freeze cards out of your deck, and this makes the combo more infrequent, now causing Murabi to more often be a dead card in your hand. And by your 8th change to the deck, you wake up realizing you're actually just playing an aggro Murloc Shaman that would be better off without the freeze cards. Well, maybe I'd keep Burlock. In an imaginary world where I'd be able to change the cards in the game, I'd make Murabi a 6 mana 6/6, I'd beef up Voodoo Hexer, and I'd make Avalanche 0 mana, because I mean come on, that card is really not that good. But I want to play with the hand I've been dealt, and I want to give my suggestions of cards that they could add to make Freeze Shaman work. I think the best route is to add more synergy cards like Murabi and Icebreaker. Despite its stats, Murabi is really good, and if you could play more than one in a game, it would legitimize a lot of bad freeze cards. It's fine if Murabi is the special one-off value legendary, but I think Blizzard should make some non-legendary freeze synergies that could get some work done. Make a minion that gets +1/+1 whenever a character is frozen, a spellstone that upgrades whenever you freeze 2 things, and maybe make a minion that deals 3 damage to all frozen characters. Blizzard needs to print more cards that give a reason to run Freeze. In Mage, Freeze could stand alone because the cards were good enough to do their job, but I think it would be kind of interesting for Shaman to maybe have sort of bad Freeze cards, but really good synergies that make them worth putting in your deck. This way, it's not the Freeze ability itself that's good, but the Shaman cards that use Freeze. Don't get me wrong, I think if they added some good Freeze cards like a 4-mana Snowstorm that just froze 5 to 10 random minions on the board, that would be cool. I think the ideal Freeze Shaman would sort of be a value tempo deck. The entire game, you're trying to combo certain Freeze cards with Freeze synergy cards until the value just quickly snowballs into a win. You can use Freeze to try to prevent aggro from killing you. Against control, you can either try to maximize value or outpace them. I just think there's a really unique archetype somewhere in Freeze Shaman that Blizzard could help print. Unfortunately, I think Freeze Shaman is kind of a scam. I mean, it went Murlocs, Freeze, and then Totems in the past 3 expansions, so I think Freeze Shaman is just phase 2 of damage control for aggro Shaman's once prominently annoying spot on top. But now that Shaman is at the bottom and cards are starting to rotate out, maybe they're going to start printing some better Shaman class cards, and it's going to be interesting what direction they'll go in. It's kind of hard to fix Freeze Shaman because there's really not much of a deck there. There's glimpses of hope every so often, little parts of gameplay where it's like, oh, that's never happened before, but the whole experience is just covered in underpowered cards, piles of confusion, and constant changes to the deck. I swear I stared at Icebreaker in my deck list for a minute straight, contemplating whether or not I should get rid of it, and if doing so made the deck no longer a true Freeze Shaman. It's safe to say my morals were tested playing this archetype. Hopefully this video gave you some insight on what Freeze Shaman is and maybe how it could be fixed. Of the 3 recently pushed obscure Shaman decks, I think this is the least fleshed out, so maybe this allowed me to project my ideals onto what it could be, but I think when the gameplay actually clicked, this deck was the most rewarding. Those are just some of my ideas of how I think Freeze Shaman could be fixed, and if I were Blizzard, I wouldn't be too worried about accidentally making this deck really good, because it's really that bad. Do you have an archetype or deck that needs fixing? Let me know down below of a deck that's past its prime, or hasn't had the chance to really spread its wings and fly. Also, I'd appreciate feedback on if you liked this series idea, changes you'd make, etc. Thank you for watching, and until next time, ta-ta.
Sonic Boom!